Hey everyone, it's Mr. Drake. If you're in my class, we have talked about the more moderate reforms made by the National Assembly during the French Revolution, but those moderate reforms didn't last. They gave way to a much more radical era. So we're going to talk about that radical era today and a particular area of it called the Reign of Terror. So by the time we're done, you should be able to explain why the monarchy was abolished in France. Remember, the National Assembly allowed the monarchy to essentially stay in power, but that did not last. And the king and queen of France were executed, and you'll understand why. You should be able to trace the later stages of the revolution, why it took the path that it did, and describe the impact of the French Revolution on France and its people, and define these people in terms down here at the bottom. National Convention, Marie Antoinette, Maximilien Robespierre, the Committee of Public Safety, and the Directory. So, we talked about the National Assembly, if you're in my class, and the reforms that they made to turn France into a republic. But what happened eventually is that the National Assembly was sort of co-opted by a much more radical faction of people who wanted to see much more sweeping reforms made than the National Assembly had already done. So they took it over and they renamed it the National Convention in 1792. And one of the first things they did once they got power is they abolished the monarchy, which was something the National Assembly had been rather hesitant to do because Louis XVI, however reluctantly, was sort of starting to agree with some of the more moderate reforms that had been made. The National Convention didn't care. They abolished it. They put Louis XVI on trial for treason. And in the year 1793, both he and his wife were executed. Louis XVI was executed first, and his wife Marie Antoinette later. Marie Antoinette was wildly unpopular in France when she became queen. She was known for wearing, these ridiculous hats and having this very extravagant fashion and tastes and being very frivolous and haughty, arrogant, as it were. To demonize her in the press, a story got around where people begging for bread, she heard about that and said, "Let them eat cake." And that's probably the most famous quote associated with Marie Antoinette, but she never actually said it. Her last words, actually, were saying "excuse me" to the executioner as she was stepping up to be guillotined because she had stepped on his foot. So Marie Antoinette probably got a bad rap, but she also lost her head along with her husband. So, war is going on in and outside of France. France is being attacked by Austria, by Spain. There's a lot of turmoil in addition to what's going on inside the country with having no king now. There being somewhat, chaos in the streets and all that. People were still starving. Nothing the revolution had done had quelled the food shortages, for example. So it came time in the eyes of some to, quote unquote, save the revolution and make sure that the reforms lasted and made sure they endure. And the National Convention created a committee of 12 people called a Committee of Public Safety to ensure that end. And the leader of the Committee of Public Safety was a man named Maximilien Robespierre, whose picture is right there. And he and the committee resorted to extremely radical, drastic measures to make sure the revolution was saved. And usually that was done by beheading people. Up to 40,000 people died at the guillotine during a 1-year-long reign of terror. If they weren't killed, a lot of them were thrown into very crowded prisons where they, in many cases, died of malnourishment and disease. So things were pretty bad. What eventually happens, if you're wondering why it ended after a year, is the Reign of Terror sort of ate its own people. The Committee of Public Safety and the National Convention were, after a while, scared that they were going to be next, that everyone who said anything that maybe supported a more moderate solution to the problems in France was being guillotined, and they were afraid they might be next. And Robespierre himself ended up being executed at the guillotine by the National Convention in 1794, which put an end to the so-called Reign of Terror. So, a new government comes after Robespierre's death. It was a directory. It was a more tight-knit group of 5 men, and you have a legislature of people who were elected by the citizens, the male citizens. It wasn't a very strong government, though, and there was a bit of a struggle for power among those people and among the legislature. And as always happens, you probably noticed, and if you're in my class, whenever we talk about stuff like this happening, when you have this weakness in government and a power vacuum, that someone's eventually going to rise to the top. And in this case, that person is Napoleon Bonaparte, who was a general in the French army and had been serving in the war against Austria and all of that. And he sort of became the uniting factor in the end. So, in the end, what are the French Revolution's effects? No more powdered wigs. Fashion became a lot simpler. You don't have the extravagances of the French nobility from before the Revolution, really, anymore. Speaking of nobility, no more nobility. All titles were stripped. Everyone simply became known as citizen. In fact, when Louis XVI was stripped of the power of the monarchy, he became known as Citizen Capet, C-A-P-E-T, after the Capetian dynasty that ruled France during the Middle Ages. And no more Christianity. As we talked about with the National Assembly, they put the church under state control and stripped them of a lot of their power. And that France underwent a period known as de-Christianization, where Christianity was de-emphasized in France. As you may be aware, a lot of this stuff does not last. The powdered wigs never really come back, but you have nobility, and in the 1800s for a while in France, the monarchy is restored, and of course Christianity eventually makes a comeback. But during the more radical days of the Revolution, all of these things were frowned upon and condemned. That'll do it for today. As always, ask your teachers if you have any questions. Cheers.